The door clicked shut behind me at 6:40 p.m., sharp and final. My daughter-in-law didn't look back. She raised her phone, turned slightly away, and said one quiet sentence I wasn't meant to hear. I stood on my own porch, keys still in my hand, realizing something permanent had just been decided, without me. I stayed on the porch longer than I should have, staring at the grain of the wooden door like it might suddenly explain itself. The air was cool, the kind that creeps into your joints before you notice, but I barely felt it. What I felt instead was the weight of my keys in my palm, proof that this house was still supposed to be mine, at least on paper. I knocked once, lightly at first, more out of habit than expectation. No answer came from inside, not even the muffled sound of footsteps. I knocked again, harder this time, letting my knuckles hit the wood with enough force to announce that I wasn't going away. Through the narrow window beside the door, I could see the hallway light still on. She hadn't gone far. I called her name, kept my voice steady, careful not to sound angry or afraid. I told myself there had to be some explanation, some misunderstanding that would make sense once she opened the door. Silence answered me, thick and deliberate. My phone buzzed in my pocket. For a moment, I felt a strange relief, thinking maybe she was calling me from the other side of the door, ready to explain herself. Instead, the screen showed a message from my son, just 3 words. Stay where you are, no punctuation, no warmth. I read it twice, then a third time, feeling something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. I typed back immediately, asking what was going on, why she'd locked me out, why he wasn't answering my calls. The message sent, the little arrow turning solid, but no reply followed. I tried calling him anyway, holding the phone to my ear while I watched my breath fog the glass of the window. It rang until it didn't. No voicemail. No explanation. Just the abrupt end of the call, as final as the sound of the lock clicking earlier. I stepped off the porch and walked a few paces down the driveway, needing space to think. This house had been mine for decades. I'd raised my children here, paid every mortgage payment, fixed every leak and crack with my own hands. When my wife passed, this place was the only thing that still felt solid, unchanged. I had let my son and his wife move in temporarily, or so I'd believed, telling myself, family helped family. Standing there now, I wondered how long they'd been planning to make that belief work against me. Another movement inside caught my eye. A shadow passed the hallway. Then the light switched off. My stomach dropped. They were settling in for the night, as if I didn't exist on the other side of the door. I felt a flash of anger then, hot and sharp, but it was quickly swallowed by something worse. Fear, not the kind that makes you panic, but the kind that sinks in quietly, telling you that control has already slipped out of your hands. I went back to the porch and tried the handle again, even though I knew it would be locked. It didn't budge. I pressed my forehead against the door, the wood cool and unforgiving, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I thought of my wife, of how she used to stand in this exact spot, laughing when the kids slammed the door too hard. I wondered what she would say if she could see me now, shut out of my own life, by the people I trusted most. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't my son. It was an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, my thumb hovering over the screen as a dozen possibilities ran through my mind. When I finally picked up, a calm, unfamiliar voice asked if I was safe where I was. The question felt strange, almost mocking, given the circumstances. I asked, who was calling? There was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional, before the voice answered that they had been asked to check on a situation involving me. I demanded to know by whom, but the voice remained measured, careful. They said my daughter-in-law had expressed concern about my behavior and well-being. I laughed once, a short, bitter sound that surprised even me. Concern. That was the word she'd chosen. I told the caller I was standing outside my locked house, that my keys were useless, that no one inside would speak to me. The voice on the line didn't react the way I expected. There was no surprise, no apology, just another pause, then a suggestion that I remain calm and stay put until they arrived. I ended the call without agreeing to anything, my hands shaking now, despite my efforts to steady them. The pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't like. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment argument or some petty power move. It felt rehearsed, official, like steps being followed in an order I hadn't been told about. I thought back to small moments I'd dismissed over the past few weeks, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room, the way my son avoided my eyes at dinner. I sat down on the porch steps, the wood creaking under my weight, and tried to slow my breathing. Part of me wanted to pound on the door again, to shout until the neighbors came out and demanded answers. Another part, quieter but stronger, told me that whatever was coming next would not be helped by losing control. I needed to see this through, to understand exactly what line had been crossed and who was standing on the other side of it. Headlights appeared at the end of the street, cutting through the darkness as they turned toward the house. I stood up slowly, my heart thudding in my ears. The car rolled closer, then stopped at the curb in front of my driveway. I watched the engine idle, the lights still on, waiting for the door to open. In that moment I realized this night was only beginning, and whatever my daughter-in-law had set in motion was already moving faster than I could stop. The car's door opened slowly, deliberately, like whoever was inside didn't want to startle me. A man stepped out first, tall, wearing a dark jacket with no markings. I could see from the porch. He didn't rush. He didn't look around as if expecting trouble. He walked up the driveway with the calm confidence of someone who believed they already understood the situation. A second figure followed him, stopping a few steps behind, watching quietly. The man introduced himself by his first name only. He said he'd been asked to do a welfare check. The words landed heavier than he seemed to realize. I told him I didn't need checking, that I was fine, that the problem was behind the locked door. He nodded as if he'd heard that explanation before. He asked if I had somewhere else I could stay for the night. The question felt like a test I didn't know I was taking. I told him no. I told him this was my home. I explained how long I'd lived here, how the deed was in my name, how my son and his wife were supposed to be temporary. As I spoke, I watched his face for signs of doubt or sympathy. He kept his expression neutral, professional, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the house, then back to me. That small movement told me he'd already heard another version of this story. He asked if I'd been feeling confused lately, if I'd had trouble remembering things, if I'd ever wandered off or forgotten where I was. Each question felt less like concern and more like a quiet accusation. I answered carefully, aware that every word mattered now. I said no. I said I was grieving, not confused. I said stress didn't mean incompetence. He wrote something down anyway. The second figure finally spoke then, introducing herself as a community liaison. She explained gently that my daughter-in-law had called earlier, worried about my safety and the safety of others in the home. She used phrases like escalating behavior and emotional instability. I felt my jaw tighten. I asked what exactly she'd reported. The woman said she couldn't go into details, only that they had to take such calls seriously. I turned toward the door and called out my son's name, loud enough that he couldn't pretend not to hear me. I waited. Nothing happened. No light flicked on. No curtain moved. The man shifted his weight, uncomfortable, and asked me not to shout. He said it might escalate things. I almost laughed again at that word, escalate. As if being locked out of your own home wasn't already the highest point. They asked if I would consent to a brief evaluation, just to put everyone's mind at ease. The way the man phrased it made refusal sound unreasonable, even suspicious. I told him I didn't consent to anything that would remove me from my home. He nodded slowly, then said they might need to consider other options, if cooperation wasn't possible. The threat wasn't in his tone. It was in the calm certainty of his words. I felt a wave of exhaustion hit me then, heavier than the fear or anger. My wife used to handle conversations like this, navigating them with a softness I never mastered. Standing there alone, I realized how exposed I was without her. How easy it was for someone else to define my reality when I didn't have a witness inside that house, willing to speak for me. The liaison suggested we move the conversation to the curb, away from the door. She said it might help everyone feel safer. I followed more because I didn't want them thinking I was uncooperative than because I agreed. From the street, the house looked different. Smaller, less like a refuge, and more like a sealed container I'd been removed from. I noticed with a jolt that the curtains in the living room had been drawn shut. They asked about my finances next, whether I managed my own accounts, whether anyone helped me pay bills. I answered honestly, unaware of where this line of questioning was heading. When I mentioned that my son had recently suggested consolidating some accounts to make things easier, the man looked up sharply. He asked if any paperwork had been signed. I said no, not that I knew of. The word "new" seemed to hang between us. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail notification from my son. I played it on speaker without thinking. His voice filled the quiet street, strained but controlled. He said this was for my own good. He said I'd scared his wife. He said professionals were involved now, and I needed to cooperate if I wanted things to go smoothly. There was no warmth in his voice, no hint of apology, just distance, like he was already talking about me in the past tense. The man asked if I'd like him to listen to the message again. More closely, I told him no. I didn't want it analyzed, dissected, turned into evidence against me, I asked. Instead, if he could ask my son to come outside and speak to me directly. He said that might not be advisable. He said emotions were running high inside the house. The implication was clear. I was the dangerous one. A neighbor's porch light came on across the street. I caught a glimpse of someone peering out, curious. Shame washed over me then, hot and sudden. This was how it would look to anyone watching. An older man standing on the curb flanked by officials, locked out of his own home. No one would ask why. They would assume the explanation they were given was true. The man told me they had a temporary solution. He said there was a place I could stay while things were sorted out. He said it didn't have to be complicated. If I cooperated, I asked what would happen to my house in the meantime. He didn't answer directly. He said the priority was safety, that word again, used like a shield against any other concern. I looked back at the house one more time, memorizing the shape of it, the way the porch light cast a familiar shadow. I realized, with a cold clarity, that this wasn't just about tonight. Whatever my daughter-in-law had started, whatever my son had agreed to, it had momentum now. And once a story like this was written down by the right people, it was very hard to erase. As the man waited for my answer, I felt the ground shift under me, not physically, but in a way that told me my position in this family had already been redefined. I hadn't agreed to anything yet. I hadn't signed anything, but the fact that these options were being presented at all told me how close I was to losing more than just access to a door. I didn't answer them right away. I stood there on the curb, hands in my pockets, feeling the outline of my keys again, like a reminder of something that used to matter. The man waited without pushing, which somehow made the pressure worse. Silence stretched, and in that space, I realized they didn't need my agreement as much as I thought. They just needed me to stop resisting. I told them I wanted my wallet and my medication from inside the house. I said I wasn't leaving without them. The liaison exchanged a glance with the man, the kind people share when they've already discussed this scenario. She said she could ask my daughter-in-law to bring those items out. The phrasing bothered me. Bring them out, as if they already belonged to her. She walked up the driveway and knocked lightly, the same door that had stayed shut when I knocked. It opened almost immediately. I couldn't hear what was said inside, but I saw my daughter-in-law's silhouette in the doorway, rigid, controlled. She didn't look toward me. She handed over a small bag and closed the door again without a word. The sound of the lock turning echoed louder than before. The liaison returned and passed me the bag. Inside were my pills, hastily gathered, and my wallet. I checked it instinctively. Everything seemed to be there, but the act of checking made my stomach churn. I hated that this was what my life had come to, verifying my own belongings on the sidewalk while strangers watched. The man said they could drive me to the place he mentioned, just for the night. He said it would give everyone time to cool off. I asked what kind of place it was. He hesitated, then said it was a short-term facility that specialized in situations like mine. I asked him to explain what situations like mine meant. He didn't answer directly. He said they focused on support and assessment. That was when something inside me hardened. Assessment meant records. Records meant decisions being made without me. I told him I wasn't going anywhere that night. I said if they weren't arresting me, they couldn't force me to leave. He nodded slowly, as if conceding a point, then reminded me that staying on the street all night might not be safe either. The word safe felt hollow now, stretched thin from overuse. He stepped aside and made a call, his back turned to me. I watched him speak quietly, nodding once, then ending the call. When he came back, his tone had changed just enough for me to notice. He said they would respect my decision for now. He said he needed to document that I'd refused temporary accommodation. He said this wouldn't end the matter. I believed him. They left shortly after, the car pulling away without urgency. I was alone again, standing in front of a house that no longer responded to me. The street was quiet, too quiet, and I felt exposed in a way I hadn't since my wife's funeral. I sat back down on the porch steps, unsure of what else to do, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the closer sound of my own breathing. Time passed strangely after that, stretching and compressing in uneven ways. I tried calling my son again, straight to voicemail. I left a message this time, my voice steadier than I felt. I told him we needed to talk. I told him this had gone too far. I didn't threaten. I didn't beg. I just stated it, hoping some part of him would recognize the truth in my words. I thought about calling a friend, but I couldn't decide who would believe me without question. That realization hurt more than I expected. I'd always thought of myself as grounded, reliable. Now I wondered how quickly that image could be rewritten by the right narrative, delivered by the right people. Eventually I heard movement inside again. Footsteps. This time, closer to the door. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff from sitting. The door opened just a crack. My daughter-in-law's face appeared in the gap, lit from behind. Her expression wasn't angry. It was composed, almost practiced. She told me I couldn't stay there. She said it wasn't healthy for anyone. She said my son agreed. I asked her when this decision had been made. She said it wasn't one moment. It was a pattern. The word hit me like a slap. A pattern implied history, documentation, justification. I told her she was rewriting events to suit herself. She didn't argue. She just said she was doing what she had to do to protect her family. I noticed she didn't include me in that definition. She closed the door again before I could respond, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the glass. I barely recognized the man looking back at me. He looked older, smaller, edged with something like defeat. I felt a surge of determination then, sharp enough to cut through the fog. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I pulled my phone out and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I'd been avoiding. My lawyer. I hadn't spoken to him since settling my wife's affairs, but I knew he'd answer. When he did, his voice was calm, familiar, anchoring. I told him what had happened, keeping my account precise, factual. I didn't dramatize. I let the facts speak for themselves. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked one question that sent a chill through me. He asked if anyone had mentioned capacity. I asked him to explain. He said situations like this often involved claims about a person's ability to manage their own affairs. He said I needed to be careful about what I agreed to next. He said I needed to come see him as soon as possible. I looked back at the house as I ended the call, seeing it now not as a home, but as a contested space. I realized my daughter-in-law hadn't just locked a door, she'd opened another one, leading into a process designed to strip things away quietly, legally, while I stood outside trying to understand what had changed. As I leaned against the porch railing, phone still in my hand, I felt the weight of what was coming settle over me. This wasn't a family argument anymore. It was a challenge to my autonomy, my credibility, my place in my own life, and I knew with a certainty that made my chest ache, that the next move wouldn't come from me. I didn't sleep that night. There was nowhere to sleep, really. I sat on the porch until the chill settled deep into my bones, then paced the length of the driveway, back and forth, like movement alone might keep me from disappearing. Every so often, I looked at the house, half expecting another light to turn on, or the door to open again. Nothing did. The place felt sealed, as if a decision had been made to let the silence do the work. Sometime later I heard a car slow near the house. My body tensed automatically, but it didn't stop. It kept going. The sound faded, leaving me alone again, with the quiet and the weight of my thoughts. I replayed the conversation with the lawyer in my head, especially that word he'd used. Capacity. It sounded clinical, harmless even, but I knew what it meant in practice. It meant other people deciding what I was allowed to decide for myself. When the sky began to lighten just slightly, I made a choice. I wasn't going to stay there any longer. Not like this. I gathered what dignity I could, and walked down the street to a small cafe that opened early. I'd been there dozens of times before, always with my wife, always at the same table. Walking in alone felt like crossing another invisible line. The smell of coffee grounded me, though, and for a few minutes I was just another customer. I sat with my back to the wall watching the door, my phone face up on the table. I expected a call from my son. I expected another message telling me what was best for me. None came. Instead, my lawyer called again. He said he'd looked into some preliminary things overnight. He said there were indicators this wasn't spontaneous. He asked if my son had access to my financial documents. I told him yes, reluctantly remembering how I'd handed things over in good faith after my wife died. He told me to come to his office. He said not to go back to the house. He said that if I did, it could be used against me as evidence of instability or fixation. Hearing my own home described that way made my stomach twist. I agreed to meet him, finishing my coffee without tasting it. At his office, everything felt controlled, orderly, the opposite of my life at that moment. He listened again, this time with legal focus, asking questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Had I signed a power of attorney? Had I agreed even verbally to let my son manage things temporarily? Had there been any medical appointments recently where my cognition was discussed? Each question felt like another brick being laid in a wall I hadn't known was under construction. He told me there was a petition being prepared. Not filed yet, but prepared. It involved temporary guardianship. He didn't say who had initiated it, but he didn't need to. I felt something hollow out in my chest. Temporary was a word that sounded harmless, but I'd learned quickly how words were being used. Temporary could become permanent if you weren't careful, if you didn't push back at exactly the right moment. I asked him what my options were. He said, the first step was visibility. He said silence would be interpreted as compliance. He advised me to document everything, to keep records of calls, messages, interactions. He also suggested a medical evaluation of my own choosing, to establish a baseline. The idea of proving my sanity felt humiliating, but I understood the necessity. This wasn't about pride anymore. When I left his office, my phone buzzed. This time, it was my son. A message. Not a call. He said we needed to talk, but not in person. He suggested a video call later that day, with his wife present. The conditions set off alarms in my head. I told my lawyer about it. He said to agree, but to keep it brief and factual. He reminded me not to argue emotionally. Facts were my only protection now. I took the call from a quiet room at the lawyer's office, wanting a witness nearby if I needed one. My son's face appeared on the screen. Tired, tense. His wife sat just out of frame at first, then leaned in deliberately, making sure I saw her. She smiled, thin and controlled, the same expression she'd worn the night before. My son spoke carefully, as if reading from something he'd rehearsed. He said they were worried about me. He said the stress after my wife's death had changed me. He said there had been incidents. I asked him to name one. He hesitated, then mentioned raised voices, misunderstandings, moments of confusion, nothing concrete. When I pushed, he deflected, saying this wasn't about proving anything. It was about safety. His wife took over then. She said they loved me, that this was hard for them too. She said locking the door had been necessary. She said calling for help had been the responsible thing to do. I asked her who she'd called before the welfare check. Her eyes flicked briefly away from the camera. She said professionals. I asked her to be specific. She didn't answer. I told them I'd spoken to a lawyer. The reaction was immediate. My son's shoulders stiffened. His wife's expression hardened. She said lawyers only made things worse. She said this could have stayed within the family. I pointed out that it hadn't, not once officials were involved. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken calculations. My son finally said something that changed everything. He said there were documents being drafted to formalize support. He said it would make things easier for everyone. He said it was temporary. I asked if he meant guardianship. He didn't deny it. He just said it wasn't a bad thing if I cooperated. The word cooperated rang in my ears long after he said it. I ended the call before it could go further, my hands steady, despite the surge of emotion inside me. I sat there for a long moment afterward, staring at the blank screen, feeling the full weight of what I was up against. This wasn't just about a house or a door anymore. It was about control, about rewriting my role in my own family. As I stood to leave, my lawyer stepped into the room. He'd listened to enough to understand. He told me we were past the point of quiet resolutions. He said the next phase would involve formal responses, court filings, and counter-narratives. He said it would get uncomfortable. He asked me if I was ready for that. I thought of the porch, the locked door, the way my daughter-in-law hadn't looked back. I nodded. I didn't feel ready, exactly, but I felt resolved. Whatever they were building against me, I wasn't going to stand still and let it close in. I left the lawyer's office with a folder under my arm that felt heavier than it should have. Inside were copies of documents I didn't remember signing and notes outlining what might already be in motion. The weight wasn't physical. It was the realization that decisions about my life were being drafted somewhere without me in the room. I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine, letting that truth settle instead of fighting it. On the drive, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't my son or my daughter-in-law. It was a bank notification. Routine at first glance, the kind I'd received 1,000 times. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. There had been a change to my account permissions. Limited access, temporary view. The wording was careful, almost polite, but the message underneath was clear. Someone else now had a say in my money. I pulled over and called the bank immediately. After the usual hold music and verification questions, a representative came on the line. She spoke gently, too gently, and told me the change had been authorized due to concerns raised by a family member. She said it was standard procedure under certain circumstances. I asked what circumstances. She said she couldn't discuss that without speaking to the person listed as my temporary point of contact. I asked who that was. There was a pause. Then she said my son's name. I hung up without saying goodbye. my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles hurt. This wasn't theory anymore. It wasn't something that might happen. It was happening, step by step, quietly, efficiently. I thought about the phrase my lawyer had used, visibility. I understood it now, in a way I hadn't before. If I didn't act fast, the version of me being recorded would become the official one. I went straight back to his office. When I showed him the bank notification, his expression tightened. He said this was escalation. He said it suggested coordination. He asked if I'd noticed any missing mail recently. I thought of the empty mailbox, the way my daughter-in-law had started bringing the mail inside herself weeks ago, insisting she was just helping. I told him yes. He nodded, writing something down. He explained that guardianship petitions often came with parallel financial controls, designed to protect assets. He also explained how easily that language could be misused. Protecting assets, he said, could look a lot like taking control of them. He told me we needed to file a formal objection before anything else was finalized. He said timing mattered now more than ever. While he worked, my phone buzzed again. A message from my daughter-in-law this time. Not emotional, not apologetic, just efficient. She said the bank changes were for my own good. She said stress made people vulnerable to scams. She said I'd thank them later. I stared at the screen, reading it again and again, feeling something cold settle in my chest. This was how she justified it. This was the story she was telling herself. I didn't reply. My lawyer advised me not to engage directly anymore. He said everything I said could be reframed. Silence, for once, was strategic. He told me we'd request an emergency hearing to contest any temporary measures already being applied. He warned me it wouldn't be quick or clean. He said, judges tended to err on the side of caution in cases like this. I asked what caution meant when you were the one being erased. He didn't answer. When I finally left his office for the second time, the day felt different, sharper, less forgiving. I drove past the house without stopping, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I couldn't trust myself not to knock again, not to demand something I already knew wouldn't be given. Instead, I went to a small hotel on the edge of town and checked in under my own name, savoring the simple act of signing for myself. In the quiet of the room, I laid everything out on the bed. My wallet, my phone, the folder of documents. I took photos of every message, every notification, backing them up in more than one place. Each click felt like a small act of resistance. I wasn't confused. I wasn't lost. I was paying attention. That evening, my son called again. I let it ring this time. I watched the screen until it went dark, then sat there listening to the hum of the air conditioner. I imagined him on the other end, frustrated, maybe even angry. I wondered if he believed what he was doing was right, or if he'd simply gone along with a plan he hadn't fully questioned. The thought didn't soften anything. It just made it clearer how alone I was in this. Later, a new email appeared in my inbox. A formal notice from a clinic, confirming an appointment for an evaluation I hadn't scheduled. The date was soon, too soon. Someone had already taken that step for me. I forwarded it to my lawyer immediately, my hands steady, despite the surge of anger rising in my chest. He replied quickly, telling me not to attend. He said attending could be interpreted as consent. I sat on the edge of the bed after that, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Every move they made was framed as help. Every objection I raised risked being labeled resistance. It was a careful trap, built from concern and procedure. I realized then that this wasn't just about control over my house or my money. It was about control over the narrative of who I was allowed to be. As night settled in, I felt a shift inside me. Fear was still there, but it was no longer alone. Anger had joined it, steady and focused, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that sharpens your thinking. I knew now that waiting would only make things worse. Whatever came next, I would have to meet it head-on, even if that meant stepping into a room where everyone else believed a version of me that wasn't true. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, my phone resting on my chest. Somewhere, paperwork was moving. Signatures were being gathered. Decisions were being framed as inevitable. I didn't know how far they'd already gone, or what the next official notice would bring, but I knew this much with certainty. The next contact wouldn't be informal, and when it came, it would carry consequences I couldn't ignore. The notice arrived the following afternoon, slipped under the door while I was in the shower. I almost missed it. Just a plain envelope. No logo, no urgency in its appearance. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Anything truly harmless didn't need to arrive quietly. I dried my hands before opening it. A habit from years of dealing with paperwork that suddenly felt like a form of self-defense. Inside was a formal letter, confirming that a temporary guardianship petition had been submitted. Not approved, not denied. Submitted. The wording was careful, neutral, as if no one wanted to take responsibility for what the words actually meant. There was a date listed for a preliminary hearing, along with a reminder that attendance was mandatory. Mandatory. I read that word several times, feeling it settle into my chest like a weight. I called my lawyer immediately. He answered on the second ring. I didn't need to explain much. He already knew this was coming. He asked me to read the letter aloud, slowly, so he could hear exactly how it was phrased. When I finished, there was a brief silence on the line. Then he said this confirmed what he'd suspected. They were moving faster than usual. That wasn't caution. That was intent. He told me the petition named my son as the proposed guardian. He said that detail mattered more than anything else. It meant this wasn't just about safety or support. It was about authority, legal authority, sanctioned by a judge, backed by paperwork that would be very hard to undo once granted. He said we needed to respond immediately, not emotionally, but decisively. I asked him what they'd claimed. He said he'd requested a copy of the filing, but hadn't received it yet. He warned me that the allegations would likely be vague, but serious enough to raise concern, confusion, volatility, inability to manage finances, emotional distress. He said these petitions rarely relied on a single dramatic incident. They worked by stacking small moments until they looked like a pattern. I thought of my daughter-in-law's word again. Pattern. The realization made my stomach turn. After the call, I sat down and forced myself to breathe slowly. Panic wouldn't help. I needed clarity. I started writing everything down, not as a story, but as a record. Dates, times, messages. Who said what and when? I didn't editorialize. I didn't explain motives. I just documented facts. The act steadied me, gave my thoughts somewhere to go besides spiraling. That evening, my son sent another message. Short, he said the hearing was a formality. He said this would protect everyone involved. He said I was making things harder than they needed to be. I read it once and then deleted it, trusting my screenshots instead. His certainty frightened me. More than his silence had, it meant he believed the system would favor him. I received a call later from someone who introduced herself as a court-appointed evaluator. She spoke in a calm, practiced tone, explaining her role as if it were a courtesy. She said she'd be reaching out soon to schedule an interview. I asked her on what basis she'd been appointed. She said the petition had raised sufficient concern. I asked if she'd read my response yet. She said there was no response on file. Not yet. When I hung up, I felt the walls closing in again. But this time I recognized the sensation. It was the same feeling I'd had standing on the porch, hearing the lock turn, the same realization that decisions were being made elsewhere. The difference now was that I understood the terrain. This wasn't about convincing my family. It was about confronting a process designed to move without me, unless I forced my way in. My lawyer called back with an update. He'd received the filing. He didn't sugarcoat it. The petition described me as increasingly erratic since my wife's death. It cited concern for my financial judgment, my emotional regulation, my resistance to assistance. It referenced a recent incident where authorities had been contacted for safety reasons. That was it. No mention of being locked out. No mention of provocation. Just a clean narrative of concern. I felt anger rise then, hot and sharp, but I kept my voice steady as he explained our options. We would file an objection. We would request an independent medical evaluation. We would challenge the urgency of the petition. He warned me that none of this guaranteed anything. Judges, he said, were human. They responded to tone as much as evidence. I needed to appear cooperative without conceding control. It was a narrow line to walk. After the call, I realized something else that unsettled me even more. My daughter-in-law hadn't contacted me at all since the petition was filed. No messages. No explanations. She didn't need to. The system was speaking for her now. Silence in this context wasn't absence. It was confidence. I went to bed early, though sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept circling back to the same thought. This had never been about helping me adjust or heal. It had been about creating a version of events that justified taking over. The lock on the door hadn't been the beginning. It had been the proof point they needed to move everything else forward. As I lay there in the dark, phone on the nightstand, I felt the weight of the upcoming hearing pressed down on me. I didn't know what my son would say under oath. I didn't know what documents my daughter-in-law had already gathered. I didn't know which version of me the court would see when they looked at the file. What I did know was this. Once this crossed into a courtroom, there would be no quiet way out, and whatever happened next would define not just where I lived or who controlled my money, but whether my voice would be believed at all. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Not imposing, not dramatic, just functional. That, somehow, made it worse. There was no sense of ceremony to soften what was happening. It felt like a place where lives were rearranged quietly, efficiently between other appointments. I sat at the table beside my lawyer, hands folded, reminding myself to breathe evenly. My son arrived a few minutes later. He didn't look at me at first. He took the seat across the room, beside his attorney, posture stiff, jaw set. When our eyes finally met, there was something unfamiliar there. Not anger, not guilt, resolve. It struck me then that he'd crossed a line internally long before any paperwork had been filed. This wasn't a reaction anymore. It was a position. The judge entered, and the room shifted. Not with fear, but with attention. This was where words gained weight. The clerk read the case number. My name. Then my son's. Hearing them linked that way made my chest tighten. The judge asked for a summary of the petition. My son's attorney stood and spoke smoothly, outlining concerns with practiced neutrality, declining judgment, emotional volatility, financial vulnerability. Each phrase was delivered as if it were a fact no one could reasonably dispute. When it was my lawyer's turn, he stood slowly, deliberately. He didn't attack. He questioned. He pointed out the lack of medical evidence. He highlighted the absence of documented incidents prior to the lockout. He asked why such an extreme measure had been pursued without first involving mediation or support services. The judge listened, expression unreadable. Then the judge asked to hear from my son directly. My son stood. He cleared his throat once, then spoke. He said he loved me. He said watching me struggle after my wife's death had been painful. He said he'd tried to help, but I'd resisted. He said the night I was locked out had scared his wife. He said he didn't know what else to do. His voice wavered just enough to sound sincere. I listened carefully, noting what he didn't say. He didn't mention asking me to leave temporarily. He didn't mention locking the door before calling for help. He didn't mention controlling my accounts. He framed everything as concern, reaction, necessity. The story was clean. Too clean. The judge turned to me then, asked if I wanted to respond. I stood feeling every year of my age, but also something steadier beneath it. I spoke slowly. I didn't accuse. I described coming home and finding the door locked. I described standing on my own porch while officials were called. I described learning about changes to my finances after they'd already been made. I said I was grieving. Yes, but grief wasn't incompetence. I said court's concern didn't justify erasing someone's autonomy. The judge asked a few questions. Precise ones about my daily routines, my bills, my understanding of my accounts. I answered each calmly. Clearly, I felt my lawyer's presence beside me, steadying. I felt the room listening, weighing. Then something unexpected happened. The judge asked if there was anyone else who wished to speak. My daughter-in-law stood. She hadn't planned to, I could tell. Her attorney looked surprised, but she was already on her feet. She spoke confidently at first, explaining her fears, her sense that something wasn't right. But as she went on, cracks appeared. She mentioned incidents that hadn't happened, timelines that didn't align. She grew defensive when questioned gently by the judge. She emphasized safety again and again, but couldn't articulate a specific danger. The judge asked her why the bank changes had been made before any court order was issued. She hesitated. She said she'd been advised it was prudent. The judge asked by whom. She named a financial consultant. The judge asked for documentation. She didn't have it. The room felt different after that. Not resolved, but unsettled. The judge didn't rule immediately. She said she needed time to review the filings and the testimony. She issued a temporary stay on any further financial changes until a decision was made. She scheduled a follow-up hearing. The gavel came down lightly, but the sound echoed in my head. Outside the courtroom, my son approached me for the first time. He looked shaken now, the resolve replaced by something closer to doubt. He said we needed to talk. I told him we already had. I said the next conversation would have to be different. He nodded, but I wasn't sure he understood what that meant. As I walked out of the building with my lawyer, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I hadn't lost, not yet. But I hadn't won either. The process was still moving. Slower now, but still moving. And I knew with a certainty that made my stomach sink that the next phase wouldn't be fought with words alone. The air outside the courthouse felt thinner than it had inside, like I'd stepped out of a sealed room into something less certain. My lawyer walked beside me without speaking, letting the silence do its work. I didn't ask what he thought. I already knew enough to understand that today hadn't ended anything. It had only changed the shape of the fight. We reached the parking lot, and that was where my son stopped me. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, eyes searching my face like he was trying to recognize someone he'd misplaced. He said my name quietly, the way he used to when he was younger and needed help without admitting it. I didn't respond right away. I waited, giving him space to say something real instead of something rehearsed. He said he hadn't expected his wife to speak like that. He said things had gotten out of hand. He said he was under a lot of pressure. Each sentence slid past me without landing. Pressure didn't lock doors. Pressure didn't freeze accounts. Pressure didn't file petitions that stripped a man of his voice. I told him that if he wanted to talk, it would be with my lawyer present. His shoulders dropped slightly, as if he'd been expecting that answer all along. On the drive back to the hotel, my lawyer finally spoke. He said the judge's questions mattered. He said the temporary stay on my finances was a good sign. He also said my daughter-in-law's testimony had raised concerns that wouldn't disappear easily, but he warned me not to assume momentum was on my side. He said people who initiate these actions rarely stop at the first setback. They adapt. I spent the rest of the afternoon alone in my room, replaying moments from the hearing in my head. The way my son's voice wavered at just the right times. The way his wife leaned on generalities instead of facts. The way the judge watched everything without revealing a thing. I realized how little of this was about truth, in the way I'd always understood it. It was about which version of reality felt safer to believe. That evening, my phone rang again. An unfamiliar number. I let it go to voicemail. The message that followed was from the evaluator, the same calm voice as before. She said she'd been informed of the hearing outcome. She said she still needed to meet with me as part of her process. She framed it as routine, neutral. I forwarded the message to my lawyer without responding. He replied quickly, telling me not to engage directly. He said, "The evaluator wasn't my ally, but she wasn't my enemy either. She was part of the machinery now." Later, another message came through, this one from my daughter-in-law. It was longer than anything she'd sent before. She said she was hurt by what had happened in court. She said she felt attacked. She said she'd only ever wanted to protect her family. She said she hoped, for everyone's sake, that I would stop fighting this and accept help. I read it twice, then a third time, feeling a slow, deliberate anger rise in me. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I understood now how words were being used. Anything I wrote could be folded into her narrative, reshaped into evidence of denial or hostility. Silence, again, was the only move that belonged entirely to me. The next morning, my lawyer called with new information. He said he'd requested discovery related to the financial changes. He said, the bank had provided records showing who initiated the review and when. The timing mattered. The request had been made before the welfare check, not after. That detail lodged itself in my chest like a shard of glass. It meant the lockout hadn't triggered concern. The concern had justified the lockout. He told me we would use that. He also told me to prepare myself. This would likely escalate the conflict, not resolve it. I asked him what escalation looked like in cases like mine. He said it could mean additional filings, emergency motions, more pressure framed as care. He said it could also mean family members doubling down rather than admitting overreach. I thought of my son's face in the parking lot, the doubt there, and wondered which direction he would go. That afternoon I went for a walk, needing movement, needing to feel my body in space without someone else defining it. I kept my phone in my pocket, resisting the urge to check it every few minutes. The world around me went on as usual. People talked, laughed, argued about small things. It struck me how invisible my situation was to anyone not directly involved, how easily a life could be upended without the world noticing. When I returned to the hotel, there was an envelope waiting at the front desk. My name on it, written in my son's handwriting. My chest tightened. As I took it upstairs, inside was a letter, handwritten, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. He wrote that he was scared. He wrote that he didn't know how things had gone so far. He wrote that his wife believed she was doing the right thing. He wrote that he didn't want to lose me. I sat on the edge of the bed and read the letter again, slower this time. There was no apology in it, no acknowledgement of harm, just fear and confusion and a desire for the conflict to end without him having to choose sides. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Love, I realized, didn't always stop people from hurting you. Sometimes it just made them justify it better. That night my lawyer sent me a draft of our formal response to the petition. It was measured, precise, unsparing in its facts. Reading it felt strange, like seeing my life translated into a language that stripped away emotion, but there was power in that too. Power in being clear, consistent, documented. I approved it without changes. As I turned off the light, I felt the weight of what was still unresolved pressing down on me. The judge hadn't ruled. The evaluator hadn't met me. My family hadn't backed down. The stay on my finances was temporary, fragile. Everything rested on what came next, on decisions that would be made in rooms I wasn't in, by people who would never know me the way I knew myself. Lying there in the dark, I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't just a fight to keep my house or my money. It was a fight to remain the authority on my own life. And whatever happened at the next hearing, whatever version of events gained traction, I knew I couldn't afford to be passive again. Because the moment I stopped pushing back, the story they were telling about me would become the only one that mattered. The hearing came faster than I expected. Not because time moved quickly, but because everything else seemed to slow around it. Days stretched thin, filled with waiting and paperwork, and the constant effort of staying composed. I learned how exhausting it was to live under observation, even when no one was physically watching. Every decision felt like it might be reviewed later, interpreted by someone searching for meaning that wasn't there. The morning of the hearing, I woke before my alarm. I lay still in the hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the building coming to life. I didn't feel fear the way I had before. What I felt instead was resolve, heavier but steadier. Fear had made me reactive. Resolve made me deliberate. At the courthouse, the atmosphere was different this time. Less tentative, more final. My lawyer briefed me quietly while we waited, reminding me of the key points, the evidence we had, the gaps in their narrative. He told me again to answer only what was asked, nothing more. I nodded. By now, restraint felt less like suppression and more like discipline. My son arrived alone. His wife wasn't with him. That detail struck me immediately. He looked tired, older than he had weeks earlier. When he sat down across the room, he avoided my eyes, focusing instead on the table in front of him. I wondered if this was doubt or simply exhaustion. I wondered how much of this he still believed in, and how much he was just enduring. The judge entered, and the room settled into attentive silence. This time, she began by summarizing the case herself, outlining the petition, the objections, the temporary stay she'd issued. Hearing her describe it all in plain terms made it sound smaller than it had felt, but no less serious. It said she'd reviewed the additional filings. She said she had questions. She started with the financial records. She asked my son's attorney to explain why account restrictions had been initiated before any court involvement. The explanation offered was cautious, layered in professional language. Concern, advice, prudence. The judge listened, then asked for specifics. Names, dates, authority. The answers grew less confident as the questions sharpened. When it was my lawyer's turn, he presented the timeline cleanly, showing how actions had preceded justification rather than followed it. He didn't accuse. He demonstrated. I watched the judge's pen move across her notepad, steady, precise. That small motion felt more significant than any argument. Then the evaluator was called to speak. She described her role, her methods, her initial impressions based on the petition. The judge asked her if she'd met me. She said no. The judge asked if she'd reviewed any independent assessments. She said no. The judge nodded slowly, then thanked her and moved on. The brevity of the exchange was telling. Finally, the judge addressed me directly. She asked how I was managing day to day. I answered honestly. I told her where I was staying. I told her how I paid my bills. I told her about the steps I'd taken to document everything. Once I realized what was happening, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't appeal to emotion. I spoke as one adult to another. She asked about my relationship with my son. That question landed differently. I paused before answering. Not to dramatize, but to choose my words carefully. I said I loved him. I said that hadn't changed. I said love didn't mean surrendering my autonomy. I said disagreements within families didn't automatically signal incapacity. The judge watched me closely as I spoke, not unkindly. My son was asked to speak again. This time his words came slower. He repeated his concerns, but with less certainty. When asked directly if he believed I was incapable of managing my affairs, he hesitated. The pause stretched. He said he didn't know anymore. That admission shifted something in the room. Uncertainty was harder to build authority on. The judge leaned back slightly, hands folded. She spoke calmly, but there was no mistaking the weight of her words. She said guardianship was a serious intervention, not a precautionary tool. She said concern alone wasn't enough. She said autonomy wasn't something to be set aside lightly. especially when alternatives existed. She said she was denying the petition for temporary guardianship. The words landed quietly, but the impact was immediate. I felt a release in my chest I hadn't realized I'd been holding back. It wasn't triumph. It was relief edged with exhaustion. The judge continued, making it clear that this didn't erase family conflict or grief. She encouraged mediation. She emphasized boundaries. She reminded everyone involved that misuse of protective systems could cause real harm. The gavel came down, and it was over. Not the conflict, not the damage, but the immediate threat. As people began to stand and gather their things, I stayed seated for a moment, letting the reality sink in. I was still myself in the eyes of the law. That mattered more than anything else. Outside the courtroom, my son approached me again. There was no audience now, no structure guiding what should be said. He looked at me, really looked, and said he was sorry, not for everything. Not clearly, but it was a start. I told him I needed time. I told him trust didn't come back all at once. He nodded, accepting that without argument. I left the courthouse alone. The air felt different again, fuller somehow, not lighter exactly, but more breathable. I walked slowly, aware of every step, every sound. The world hadn't changed, but my place in it had steadied in the days that followed. Things didn't magically repair themselves. My son moved out with his wife. The house was quiet when I returned, emptier than I remembered. Familiar rooms felt altered, touched by absence. I changed the locks myself, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Control regained wasn't something I took for granted anymore. We began mediation later, cautiously, with clear boundaries. Some conversations ended abruptly. Others went better than expected. Healing, I learned, wasn't a straight line. It didn't always move forward. Sometimes it circled back on itself, testing old wounds. But I stayed present. I stayed aware. At night, alone in my house again, I sometimes stood by the front door and remembered the sound of it locking from the other side. The memory still hurt. It probably always would. But it no longer defined me. It had become a reference point, not a verdict. What I understood now, more clearly than ever, was how fragile autonomy could be when others decided they knew better. How easily concern could become control. How important it was to pay attention before small concessions became permanent losses. I didn't come out of this stronger in the way people like to talk about strength. I came out changed, more cautious, more deliberate, less willing to hand over pieces of myself without understanding the cost. And if there was one thing I carried forward with absolute certainty, it was this: the most dangerous betrayals don't always come with anger or malice. Sometimes they arrive wrapped in concern, spoken softly, justified carefully. And by the time you realize the door has been locked behind you, the real fight has already begun.